The city square was packed, a sea of bodies moving like a restless tide. Protest signs bobbed above heads, their messages bold and angry. Chants echoed between the buildings, voices rising in unison, filled with fire and frustration. Dan Carter walked right through the middle of it, not because he wanted to, but because the VA clinic was 3 blocks down, and he wasn't about to take the long way around just because a few kids were mad at the world. The protest had started earlier that morning, something about government corruption, endless wars, greed. Dan didn't disagree with most of it. He'd seen firsthand how messy the world could be. But these people, they weren't interested in listening. They wanted someone to blame. And when Dan's old military jacket caught the eye of one of them, he knew exactly who that someone was going to be. "Hey!" Dan kept walking. The voice was young, sharp, challenging. He ignored it. Then came the second one. "Hey! I'm talking to you, soldier boy!" Dan stopped. Slowly, he turned to see a young man, maybe mid-20s, standing near the edge of the protest crowd. His hair was buzzed short, his hoodie pulled up over his head. He had a smirk on his face, like he was looking at a joke only he understood. Around him, others started noticing. Dan sighed through his nose. "Here we go." The kid nodded at his jacket. "What's with the outfit, old man? You lost, or are you just here to recruit more brainwashed killers?" Dan's jaw tightened. He had heard it all before. Murderer, puppet, government dog. Most of the time, he let it slide, because arguing with ignorance never led anywhere. But the crowd was growing now, circling, waiting for his reaction. The air buzzed with energy. And then, spit. It landed right on Dan's boot. The crowd laughed. The smirking kid crossed his arms, waiting for a reaction, waiting for Dan to snap, waiting for him to prove them right. Dan exhaled slowly. He bent down, not quickly, not aggressively, just calm, steady. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn, faded cloth, and wiped the spit from his boot with careful precision. The laughter died down, because they weren't expecting this. Dan stood back up, tucked the cloth away, and locked eyes with the kid. "You done?" he asked. The smirk faltered. Dan took a slow step forward. The crowd stiffened, not out of fear, not yet, but because there was something in the way Dan moved, something in the way he carried himself. It wasn't aggression, it was unshakable confidence. The kind of confidence that didn't come from books or protests. The kind of confidence that only came from knowing exactly what kind of hell a man could survive. Dan's voice was calm, even, dangerous. "I fought for your right to do that," he said simply. Silence. For the first time, the protesters didn't know what to say, because he didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man who had seen too much to waste his time on rage. The smirking kid opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dan nodded. "You can spit on me, you can insult me, you can scream in my face and call me every name you've got." He took another step closer, and this time, nobody laughed. "But you'll never break me." The protest crowd stood frozen. The laughter, gone. The confidence, shaken. Because they had expected rage. They had expected violence. They had expected the broken, angry veteran stereotype they had painted in their heads. But Dan Carter just stood there, calm as a mountain, looking at them with the eyes of a man who had already seen the worst this world had to offer. And he hadn't flinched once. The kid who had spit on Dan's boot shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. The bravado was gone now, replaced with uncertainty. Dan tilted his head slightly. "You think I'm your enemy?" he asked, his voice quiet but strong. No one answered. "You think I wore this uniform because I wanted to hurt people?" The protesters looked at each other, suddenly unsure. Dan nodded slowly. "That's what they tell you, right? That men like me are nothing but killers? That we fought in wars we didn't understand? That we did nothing but follow orders like mindless machines?" A few heads in the crowd nodded. Dan exhaled through his nose. "You think I fought for politicians? For money? For oil?" The silence was louder than any chant they had shouted earlier. Dan took a step forward. "Let me tell you what I fought for." He gestured to the crowd. "I fought for every single person standing here, even the ones who hate me." Someone in the back muttered, "Bullshit." Dan's eyes snapped to him. "Say that again!" The protester looked down. Dan shook his head. "Number? You listen. I fought for your right to say that. I fought so you could stand here today, scream in my face, and never once fear that someone would put a bullet in your skull for speaking your mind. His voice wasn't angry, it was steady, controlled, and that's what made it so damn powerful. I fought for the kid who spat on my boot, Dan said, glancing at the young man who had gone dead silent. I fought for the people who waved at me when I came home, and for the people who turned their backs on me. I fought for those who thanked me, and for those who cursed my name. His gaze swept across the protesters. You think you know who I am? He asked. You don't. You never will. Because the only people who understand men like me... He hesitated just for a second. Then his voice dropped lower. Are the ones we buried. The energy in the protest changed. The people in the back, the ones who had been watching quietly, started lowering their signs. A young woman, no older than 20, tore off the anti-military slogan taped to her poster. Another man shifted uneasily, shoving his hands into his pockets, like he suddenly didn't want to be there. Because Dan Carter hadn't fought them. He hadn't shouted them down or thrown fists or proven their image of him right. He had done something worse. He had made them think, and that was something they weren't prepared for. One by one, people started to leave, not in a dramatic, angry exodus, but in quiet, uneasy retreat. A young man nudged his friend, whispering, "This doesn't feel right, man. Let's go." Another protester turned their sign around, as if suddenly ashamed of what it said. The kid who had spit on Dan's boot, he hadn't moved. He couldn't move. Because for the first time in his life, he realized he had no idea what the hell he was talking about. Dan exhaled, shook his head, and turned away. Not in anger, not in victory, just in understanding. He didn't need to prove anything to them, because he already knew who he was. And now, so did they. Dan walked past the thinning crowd, heading toward his original destination, the VA clinic a few blocks away. As he reached the edge of the protest, he heard a voice behind him. "Hey, wait." Dan stopped, turned. It was the young man, the one who had spit on him. His face was different now, less sure of himself, less angry. Dan stared at him, waiting. The kid fidgeted, took a breath. Then, voice quiet, uncertain, I'm sorry." Dan nodded. Then he turned away again, disappearing into the city.